Whatever we learn through a lens and a sieve. Much of the lens's focus is controlled by the powers teaching us, but the sieve is our own, catching what we want to hold on to. This is certainly true of, well, everything, but doubly so for how we are taught and learn history and religious texts. We are guided to certain interpretations by teachers, preachers, parents, and society, and we can accept or reject these interpretations or viewpoints. The wider range of the lenses we look through, the broader understanding we are left with in our sieves. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's 2016 book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, sits heavy in my own sieve. The book takes a dense look at U.S. history, and prior, he starts with Aristotle, through the lens of racist thought and policy. Reading it was immensely eye-opening. He presents his definition of a racist idea early on: any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way, and comes through the history of anti-black racism and its conjoined twin of capitalism, both stemming from self-interested social and financial policies in Christian Europe, policies which were defended by the creation of racist ideas. I actually taught a Sunday school class on this book at a local Mennonite church, and please, feel free to giggle at whatever incorrect but hilarious image comes to mind thinking about that sentence. It's a dense book, and this is a worn copy, the one I taught out of, beat up and often with full pages highlighted. Throughout this history, Dr. Kendi seeks to show that it is not enough to be non-racist, but nothing can be changed until we are anti-racist. But further, he's also interested in letting white folks know that anti-black racist policy also holds back white people. It's in everyone's best interest to abolish these ideas. This week, I want to talk less about the book itself and more about a real-world application of the history as Dr. Kendi presents it. Presidential elections in Florida. In 2018, 2 years after this book was printed, 65% of voters in the state of Florida said yes to re-enfranchising returning citizens. People who had been convicted of a felony, spent their time in prison, and were released. At that time, Florida was one of only 10 states who not only took away the right to vote from people being punished by the state, but refused to reinstate it even after that punishment had ostensibly ended. This vote should have re-enfranchised 1.6 million people, 10% of the voting age population of the state, and the largest group of enfranchisement in the U.S. in half a century. The amendment as passed was clear. Floridians overwhelmingly wanted no restrictions to returning citizens regaining their right to vote. This would have overturned a law 150 years old. In fact, the law to disenfranchise anyone convicted of bribery, perjury, forgery, and other high crimes dates to Florida's first constitution, going into effect in 1845, when Florida became a state. But the particular felony language dates to the Reconstruction era, with Florida's post-war constitution of 1868. Chapter 19 of Stamped covers this era, and it's not called Reconstructing Slavery for nothing. Here, Dr. Kendi points out, as many have recently, that while the 13th Amendment is seen to have banned slavery, it allows for slavery as punishment for a crime. The end of the war and the end of slavery was not the end of anti-black violence across the country, with the first KKK being founded in 1865. Kendi writes, as another example, in early May 1866, white mobs in Memphis killed at least 48 black people, gang raped at least 5 black women, and looted or destroyed $100,000 worth of black-owned property. The clear loophole in the 13th Amendment and the ambiguities in the language of the 14th Amendment left a clear path forward for anti-black racism to be codified into state laws, particularly after the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which led to the first African-American members of Congress, including Hiram Revels, who would hold the Senate seat once occupied by Jefferson Davis. In the 150 years since his election, only 9 other African Americans have served in the U.S. Senate. The Crisis, a Columbus, Ohio-based newspaper, claimed at the time that the 15th Amendment was a, quote, bogus amendment designed to usher in black supremacy. They didn't use the word black, though. White people across the nation would not stand for it. The aftermath of the war and the amendments not only saw anti-black violence, but led to a rise in black codes, laws specifically designed to criminalize black lives. Post-war, this included laws across the country that required the formerly enslaved to work for their former enslavers. And even if the law didn't make it explicit, circumstances made it unavoidable. As W.E.B. Du Bois would write in 1935, slavery was not abolished even after the 13th Amendment. There were 4 million freedmen, and most of them on the same plantation, doing the same work that they had before the emancipation, except as their work had been interrupted and changed by the upheaval of war. Moreover, they were getting about the same wages, and apparently were going to be subject to slave codes modified only in name. There were among them thousands of fugitives in the camps of the soldiers or on the streets of the cities, homeless, sick, and impoverished. They had been freed practically with no land nor money, and save in exceptional cases, without legal status and without protection. In those words, Du Bois echoes a black Union veteran who Dr. Kendi quotes, "If you call this freedom, what do you call slavery?" With the 14th Amendment, black codes had to be written with race-neutral language. In fact, racial disparities in outcomes of a law couldn't be used to prove racial intent of that law. What could be used would be race-specific language in the law itself. As such, laws that would also catch many poor whites were passed because they would primarily punish black folks. Eventually, black codes would give way to the separate but equal accommodations of Jim Crow, and a whole new generation of black lives being criminalized. But even after Jim Crow, much later in the 20th century, we see Reagan's war on drugs and the crime bills of the 90s, which led directly to an astronomical increase in prison populations, disproportionately affecting people of color. In fact, such laws were designed explicitly to provide greater punishments for perceived black crimes, such as providing for a far harsher punishment for crack versus equally potent amounts of regular cocaine. So we have a historical pattern of criminalization of black lives, and 2 decades of an increase in criminalization, while many states bar those in prison from voting, and some continue to bar returning citizens from voting even after release. From this, I hope it becomes clear that the creation of felonies is by its very nature voter suppression. And all these strands come together in Dr. Kendi's framing of the 2000 presidential election. He starts by quoting the United States report to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a report issued in September of the year 2000. U.S. law guarantees the right to participate equally in elections, the State Department had assured the United Nations. But on November 7th, 2000, tens of thousands of black voters in Governor Jeb Bush's Florida were barred from voting or had their votes destroyed, allowing George W. Bush to win his brother's state by fewer than 500 votes. Kendi here isn't even talking about the over 1 million voters kept off the voter rolls in Florida because of their past convictions, but the perhaps over 100,000 voters that the company ChoicePoint advised the state to purge. In one set particularly, ChoicePoint was tasked with finding 8,000 felons who shouldn't have been registered, and instead turned in a list of 8,000 people convicted of misdemeanors who were still dutifully purged. Now, you can't know how these 8,000 or the 100,000 would have affected the 2000 election. Maybe that 500 vote difference would have been larger. Of course, we can be pretty sure that Republicans who led the purge anticipated that those votes would have gone to Al Gore. And of course, we can come back to this year and the aftermath of that 2018 Florida amendment to re-enfranchise 1.6 million voters. In the time since, Republican legislators in Florida and the Republican governor have done everything they can to thwart the will of the people, culminating in requiring that the formerly incarcerated pay off so-called fines associated with their detainment, a stipulation not in the amendment as voted on. While lower courts pointed out the clear violation of the people's will, in May of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that poll tax, leaving 774,000 people disenfranchised in Florida. As I write this, with 98% of precincts reporting, there are under 400,000 votes, putting Donald Trump in the lead over Joe Biden in that state. So I share all this because last night I saw once again, as I saw in 2016 and in 2000 and so many other elections, people around the country blaming Florida and other states for voting against their own interests. But the truth of the matter is, 150 years of voter suppression continues today. And indeed, it's in hyperdrive. As Bob Herbert wrote in the New York Times in 2000, quoted and stamped, "The tactics have changed, but the goal remains depressingly the same. Do not let them vote. If you can find a way to stop them, stop them." Anyone interested in keeping that cycle from starting again before the next election can donate to the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition's fund to pay off the fines of returning citizens in Florida at wegotthevote.org. Please do.
Every time we look away, the cycle starts again. Foolish movement permeates the height of every man. Every time we look away, the cycle starts again. Foolish movement permeates the height of every man. Oh, what the enemy's on. 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 A candle flicker just to show the life it has inside. Persistently it lights the way without a thought besides. A candle flicker just to show the life it has inside. Persistently it lights the way without a thought besides. Where has my memory gone? All of my memory gone. Where has my memory fight.